two sessions, China's annual political event has concluded in Beijing. It brought together lawmakers and political advisors to chart the way forward for the country.
During the meeting, Chinese Premier Li Qiang delivered the country's 2025 work report that sets a wide range of economic and development goals for the country to pursue in the coming year.
So what impact will China's new economic development blueprint have on Africa?
On this special joint edition of program, we take an in-depth look at China's two sessions and explore what lies ahead for the continent. I am Abdiaziz Hashim from the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation.
And I'm Beatrice Marshall from CGTN. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, joining me now to take a closer look at the 2025 two sessions are Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagine. She's joining in via Zoom from London. Also via Zoom in Beijing, Aina Tanjan, Senior Fellow at the Tai Ho Institute and Current Affairs Commentator. Joining me here in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and Chief Executive of Africa Policy Institute, which is also our partner for this event. And James Shikwati, founder of Inter-Region Economic Network. We also have an audience of researchers from the Africa Policy Institute and students from the University of Nairobi. Welcome everybody to this discussion. Let me start off with you, Aina Tanjan. China has just concluded its annual two sessions. First of all, what are the key measures announced that will propel China's economic and social development in 2025?
I think the main takeaway from the two sessions is that China is proceeding confidently in the face of economic and political headwinds being created by the United States. Although there was no real direct mention of Donald Trump, he was certainly in the background. China has estimated, it is predicted that they will reach around 5% GDP target by the end of this year, and that they can continue to want to engage in the world. Particularly Wang Yi, the foreign minister, made it clear he does not believe this idea that countries only have interests, not allies. China believes that friendship is important and that win-win mutual advantage is the key to a multipolar world that is sustainable.
Well, Hannah, China has set a 5% economic growth target. Maybe you could tell us, what are China's key development tasks for 2025?
Well, that 5% growth has got to come from a range of different places. And I think this is also a key message from the two sessions, that even though, of course, China remains the world's manufacturing powerhouse, it's not just about manufacturing, it's also about driving up domestic consumption. And that was, this has been a long-term goal for China to do that. Of course, COVID-19 was a big interrupter to that in terms of both driving down consumption and also, making people feel a bit less unsafe in terms of finances, but also with having to really ramp up manufacturing for the rest of the world at that point. So this is still a transition China's making to become this economy that's got value addition at the top level with the high technology, as well as still manufacturing to some degree, but at the same time also driving up consumption of a much wider part of society.
So Hannah's mentioned a very interesting point regarding manufacturing. James, I want to come to you on that one because the whole issue of high quality development has been part of China's domestic policy for the last few years. And the focus on high quality means that China is gradually moving away from the traditional manufacturing domestically, but more towards new, more sustainable, environmentally friendly ways of pursuing development goals. So is there an opportunity here for Africa to seize?
Thank you very much. I would say there's a very big opportunity, especially when we compare the two sides. You notice, for example, China contributes 31.1% to the global market. Africa jointly contributes only 2%. So when you see a major contributor creating a shift to another level, it means Africa has the opportunity to seize what China has been doing, but of course, domesticate it within the context of Africa to grow its capability in terms of contribution to the global market economy and also to the growth in the continent.
But when you look at Africa's situation, a lot of African countries are yet to industrialize. And with many countries now moving away from fossil fuels, how is Africa going to adapt? What must Africa do to take advantage of this Chinese policy to grow its own manufacturing on the continent?
Yeah, first of all, of course, is to look at how Africa can continue the relationship that has been there and upgrade it so that they accelerate in terms of infrastructure construction, which is key to connect countries within Africa, and then digitalization to make sure that we tap into the high tech that China is already demonstrating they are ahead of the world. And the third one, which is quite unique for us, Africa, is to borrow intelligently from China. What do I mean by this? You notice that China have created a strong identity about themselves. They have created a strong narrative about themselves, so they own the development. Africa is yet to create its own narrative. We are yet to have a narrative where you say this is Africa driving the process. A lot of what is happening in Africa would be driven by somebody else. So I would say the third point would be to invest in growing an African narrative so that Africans can own the process of development.
And of course, Professor, speaking on development, we're talking about the overall growth of China, what we have witnessed over the years right now, in terms of overall requirement of economic and social development for the year 2025. Mm-hmm. In your view, Prof, could you tell us how does China define high quality development, and how does that differ in the past growth of models comparing to the African continent?
Well, first up, what we need to pay attention to is that this is a very significant moment when the two sessions are meeting. Significant particularly for Africa. This is the year that follows the adoption of the Beijing Action Plan, which is the blueprint that's going to guide Africa's development in the next 3 years up to 2027. And the action plan was launched this year, just a month ago. And therefore, those of us who are watching development in China are looking to see how China is positioning itself economically and otherwise to support Africa's development. And here, the optimism of about 5% growth is very, very important in the sense that it spells, it's a good message for the continent that China will be able to meet its commitments to Africa's development to that extent. The emphasis in Chinese development, as you're watching, is essentially boosting growth. And on the continent, it is the same language. And if you look at the priorities that China and Africa are focusing on, one of them is expanding trade. Mm-hmm. The other one is focusing on investment, particularly investment that moves Africa from the traditional raw material exporter to a consumer of industrial goods now to a producer of value-added goods. And this means that we're going to bridge the gap between China and Africa in regard to trade. We're going to create employment for a burgeoning youth sector in Africa. And I think one message that one can put forward is that we wish China well, because a healthy China means a prosperous Africa.
Mm-hmm. Prof, it's good you brought about trade, especially between China and Africa. In terms of key development, what are some of the key indicators of a successful development? Well,
the tragedy with Africa, which is a good symbol of a bad development, is that we are not industrialized, and all efforts have been made by traditional partners to ensure that we continue to be a consumer of the industrial products and a supplier of underpriced raw materials. And I think this is what is being reversed. And I think this is what good development means, that we can balance between production of raw materials and production of industrial manufactures. So manufacturing is key to Africa's development. And I think this is at the heart of the Beijing Action Plan. And that means also transfer of technology And China seems to be the only power that is willing to transfer technology to Africa at all levels. And when you scope across the continent, there is no country on the African continent that has become immune to the transfer of technology by China, which is good news for Africa's dream of renaissance. African renaissance must be driven by technology, and not just technology, obsolete technology that pollutes the environment, but technology that is also environmental friendly. This is what the two session is promising. That there is a synergy between the message that's coming from the two session and the message that came from Beijing, and that message is positive for Africa.
Indeed, a symbiotic relationship even between the two continents itself. Let's move this conversation to our audience here. Dennis, good morning and thank you for joining us. Who is your question directed to?
Thank you very much. My question goes to Hannah. Given China's ambitious economic goals and the potential for a trade war with the US, how do you foresee the impact of this development on Africa's economy, and particularly in terms of trade and investment?
Really good question. I think we need to be, as Africans, really thoughtful and intentional around our trade relationships, both with China and the rest of the world. We are going into a sphere of more protectionism in the rest of the world, whereas on the African continent, I think we have been not only ourselves pushing for much more free trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also we have been trying to encourage the rest of the world to become more open to us, and even to create preferential schemes and to deepen preferential schemes for trade with us, because we still remain at 4% or less of global trade for most of the G20 countries, for example. So we have to keep pushing on opening up for African products in both markets. And it seems that China is certainly more open to that. And what we must also do is to push for the diversification of supply chains in terms of where, for instance, Chinese manufacturers might be facing challenges and tariffs being applied from the US if they are manufacturing in China, but perhaps if they're manufacturing on our continent, they may not face such challenges. I say they may because we don't know about the future. We cannot tell how the US trade view will continue. However, at this point, diversification is everything. And I think this is how we can be more intentional and push manufacturing to our continent, as others have mentioned, is so important.
So I want to hear your comment to that, Aina Tangen, because there has been a lot of focus from China on high quality development. But I want to hear from your side, why is there such a focus from China on high quality development first?
China moving from a secondary to a tertiary economy, and the reason they're doing it is because there's more profits, more higher wages. They've reached the threshold where they do not want to be trapped in the middle income trap. They want to move beyond that. In order to do that, they have seen and studied historically that means that you have to embrace technology, innovation, and efficiency. So that is China's plan. In terms of the rest of the world, it's not just Africa that China is interested in. They're interested in the global South and also Central Asia. These are areas, especially the global South, that was dominated by colonial powers. They, belittled everybody they conquered. I mean, Africa has so many countries that have rich historical precedents as empires. And yet, most Americans think that Africans wander around in, loincloths in the bush. This was deliberate, and yes, I agree, JP, there has to be a better narrative. But I'm going to take it one step further. China is not going to solve Africa's problems. Only Africa can solve its problems, and that means on a country-by-country basis, Africa has to come together and start figuring out its future. And its future as a resource area is it has to start putting together forces that mimic what has happened with oil at OPEC. There are 4 countries in the world that grow the majority of coffee. Yet coffee is dominated as an industry by 4 European and American companies that dictate the price and where it's going. Why is that even possible when if these countries were to come together and simply say, we will create our own exchange. We will set coffee prices that at an amount that allows not only our farmers to get paid, but also to take care of the environmental degradation that has happened, that is a result of the colonial powers, and to develop our economies. I really do believe that Africa's future is in Africa's hands, not in anybody else's.
Okay, Tanjin, on that particular point, let's move now to the audience so that we can circle back to that particular point. Steve, what is your question?
I have a question to the professor. In China's domestic economy, driving domestic consumption is a priority to spur economic growth. How can Africa leverage its own youthful population to spur economic growth?
Thank you. That's a good question because the population of African youth, talking about those who are 35 and below, is now about 65%, to say. So empowering the youth basically means empowering Africa. And therefore, if you could go by the example of what is happening in China, promoting domestic economy, it means that they are creating jobs for their population, they are adding value to the economy, and they are getting everybody participating in that economy. And I think that's something that Africa should emulate. We need to create jobs, and that means that we need to leverage technologies that are coming from China and technologies that are being developed internally by Kenyans, particularly the digital economy, in order to be able to create jobs for young people. And it's not just jobs. We need also to empower the young people of Africa to be entrepreneurs themselves, employing others. So this is where we're going. We need basically to move to new technologies. You do know that in the last 2 sessions, China talked about the high productive forces. And this is the new technology, the cutting edge technology. That's where Africa needs to move.
So Hannah, let's talk about the difficult economic environment around the world in the last couple of years. And Chinese Premier Li Qiang did mention that in the work report. And he said that despite a complex and challenging global environment, China achieved a 5% economic growth, contributed to about 30% of global GDP. Foreign trade reached record highs, with foreign exchange reserves surpassing $3.2 trillion. What were the key drivers of this, and how did that impact the global economy?
Well, as you say, there has been, and as the work report was saying, it has been a very challenging global environment. Even on our continent, we have had to deal with increasing inflation in many places. We see countries also facing challenges in terms of debt management and so on. Generally, a more expensive environment. And uncertain, even with aspects like climate change. However, there are places of resilience and also places of growth. And I think China is a country where it's not just resilient; it's managed to overcome many of those barriers. And I think part of that has been through innovation, really pushing companies and to come to to really innovate in terms of areas such as the environmental goods, whether it's renewable energy or electric vehicles and so on. So finding new sources of growth, I think, has been fundamental to China's strategy for dealing with the global challenges. I would also say China has faced its own challenges. Some of the previous growth areas, such as real estate and construction, have faced problems. And again, what we've seen is a responsive government in terms of providing some extra fiscal stimulus and also supporting debt restructuring for some of those sectors. So it's really about being proactive, being very intentional. And I think that's where China's been able to not only show resilience, but also growth.
And indeed, on that note, we need to take a short break now. And when we'll come back, given that you've heard all about the two sessions, we want to look at the outcomes given that 2025 and how it will affect or impact rather the African continent.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are James Shikwati, Professor Peter Kagwanja, Aina Tangen, and Hannah Ryder. Before the break, we looked at some of the highlights of the 2025 two sessions. Let's now look at how they may impact Africa. Aina Tangen, innovation-driven development is a key development goal for China in 2025. Now, China's innovation capabilities, as we've seen in the past, range from the Shenzhou space missions, the Chang'e lunar exploration program, 5G quantum computing, and AI like DeepSeek. How will China maintain its momentum, though, in the wake of US-China competition in technology?
Well, I mean, it really begins with education. China has a 99.8% literacy, high school literacy or above, among people under 30. Compare that to the United States. There's only 60% of the country that reads at or up to a sixth grade level. 40% is able to read and write above a sixth grade level. I mean, obviously, if your people are not prepared to take advantage of the digital revolution, you're going to be left behind. So I really do believe that one of the keys here is not only for China, but Africa. There's an increasing larger number of students coming from Africa to China to learn about innovation, how to do it. And I think that is something that's very, very important, not only to Africa, but also to China as well. I mean, the digital revolution is not something which, you contain in a bottle. It's something that when it's shared, it's more powerful. The more data you have, the more markets you reach, the more opportunities there are. And so China sees this as mutual cooperation, as win-win, and they're willing to share. This is not like other countries who see the IP is something that you hoard and then extract value from. China sees it as something that has to be shared as part of a win-win solution.
So James, let's talk about that sharing for win-win solution and taking advantage of the technology space here. What should Africa do, though, to catch up with the rest of the world in the global tech space?
Yeah, I think first of all is to take some lessons from the two sessions. One of the key lessons from the two sessions is how China's development is future-oriented. They are not just talking about planting maize and planting sugarcane. They are looking at future technologies. They are imagining an economy that none of us have already even reached there. So it becomes important that Africa learns something from there, that even as you seek to focus on the current challenge, think about the future. When it comes to the AI, it's quite interesting that already the Africa Union launched an artificial intelligence strategy paper last year in July, and there are the estimates that AI can really enable Africa to unlock close to $1.5 trillion worth of economic activity within the continent. And as our colleague just pointed out correctly, we have to look at the quality education, because it's not just education. We have to start querying the type of education that we give to our young people. We should not forget that quite a number of countries still believe wrongly that education is teaching somebody how to speak English or to speak French. So quality education means the content has to align with the trend that is happening globally in terms of use of technology. And quite interesting about artificial intelligence is that if we don't embrace it, we'll be left out completely, because you'll notice even now for the youth, whenever they do their research papers, they can actually rely on technology to write a paper for them. So meaning that Africa really has to take some of these deep lessons. But lastly, third point from the two sessions is what they refer to as the quality development.
Right.
You'll notice that for Africa, our development is aligned to political campaign, 5-year cycle. So there's no focused, deep thinking about what type of project are you giving to your country. Everybody's in a hurry to put up some monument so they win elections.
Right.
And what China is telling us, look for quality development, which has long-term aspect to whatever you develop. Don't just put up maybe a water tank and then say you've created development. So I think there's a lot that African leaders and Africans can pick from these two sessions to remodel how we do our development.
Professor, your take.
I think the most important thing that has been said is where to begin investing so that to get a quality development. Quality development will come from quality citizens, and quality citizens will come from a good education. And good education is just not technical education per se. It's a thinking population that is able to transform whatever is in their environment for the improvement of the economy. And lessons are there from China and other developing countries that this is possible. Kenya is leading in Africa and in the world in terms of the digital development, digital economy. And it is a country that can leverage some of these technologies in order to add value. Now, but we have to build on what we have. Agriculture is our mainstay, and therefore we need to industrialize agriculture, industrial manufacturing, and therefore the softwares that are beginning to come, the AI and other aspects of technology must focus on what we are good at in agriculture. Otherwise, we might as well create a very abstract economy that does not resonate with our own. Our technology must seek to ensure that we understand our environment to the full, and we are doing that innovatively to be able to leverage our add value, our value addition in our economies. That is where we need to move, and in this, partnership is key.
Now, let me go to Hannah now. Hannah, we're talking about how the US President Donald Trump's approach to China in terms of tariffs as well as technological restrictions. How will that reshape the global trade and investment?
Yeah, it's very difficult to tell at this moment how there will be changes. I think most countries are thinking about how they can manage in terms of making sure that they can be resilient to major changes in terms of trade flows. But on the other hand, I think there is still an opportunity here for African countries, especially when it comes to strategic minerals, when it also comes to the need for more manufacturing and supply chain diversification. These are ways in which African countries can position themselves, and particularly as a region, and also sub-regions, we can position ourselves to be the new location for certain types of manufacturing, or also in terms of diversifying trade and avoiding some of those tariffs and so on. So I think there's opportunity, but we also still have to be very cautious. And I think at this point, the more that we are able to manufacture the goods that we need and also work with China to increase trade to China will also help in our strategies going forward.
Indeed, talking about technological advancement, you do know that the African continent as well with China have had over 16 years of a relationship that is symbiotic by nature, but at the end of the day, improving the lives of the African people. Now let's move across the floor once more. Miriam.
Thank you so much. My question goes to Aina Tangen. Okay, so with the AI growing and China's innovation, for example, the DeepSeek, so what are the ethical concerns of policies from the Chinese government that will impact and protect privacy globally?
Well, I mean, there are a number of concerns. Obviously, privacy is one. Crime. DeepSeek is just like a knife. It can cut both ways. And it has to be controlled. There are ethical considerations that are involved that go beyond privacy to exactly what DeepSeek can't do. AI in general, the idea that it's going to replace people, how do you deal with that? I mean, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, you had many people saying that it was going to ruin the world. People would be thrown out of jobs and nothing, and no good would come of it. It took some time to adjust. But in the end, the Industrial Revolution unleashed a new era of prosperity. So that is the issue that you have with AI and DeepSeek, is how to do it. Now, China took a very different approach, and it's very germane to what we're talking about. China adopted what they call open source system. So pretend you create a public library, and people can borrow from that library in order to create new solutions. It's very different from the United States approach, where it was basically, we're going to build our own library, we're going to own it, and if you want to use our product, we're going to charge you very high prices for it, because it took a lot of money to build this private library. So very different approaches. And what China is offering is something that is much more approachable from the African side, because DeepSeek is free, as opposed to open AI, which is not.
So I want to keep you there for a moment, Aina Tangen, because I also want to get your response to the question on the future of multilateralism, because Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China will uphold multilateralism and build more consensus for an equal and orderly multipolar world. And yet, US President Donald Trump is going ahead with America first. So from where you sit, though, what do you think the future of multilateralism will look like?
Well, first off, multilateralism is not the future, it is the present. The question is, how is it going to be organized? Donald Trump is an aberration. He's basically trying to reassert the American empire, this idea of taking, the Panama Canal, Canada, Greenland, and Gaza, because it's either profitable or good for America, or there's a security concern, is something that belongs to the colonial model that everyone assumed had gone away. What China is saying is that it is not about just interests. It is about friendship, long-lasting relations, mutual benefit, and that is the basis of multilateralism. China pushes three principles that are not ideological. They're very pragmatic. Every country needs to be secure. Every country needs a path to development. And every country has to be understood and respected as a sovereign nation. That's a mosaic of many different, in many cases, languages, groupings, beliefs, history, etc. So that is a completely different approach. It's one that is in tune with, I think, most countries, the vast majority of countries, their aspirations to be recognized for what they are and have a path to development and be secure.
Indeed, picking up from where Tangen has left it, Professor Kagwanja, we're talking about modernization, and globalization is very key at this day where the world is moving towards to. In the words of the Foreign Minister, that is Wang Yi, he stressed a lot about Africa being the fertile land of hope, as well as in the 21st century. For us to reach that modernization level, why is that important?
Modernization is important, but you must define modernization within the African context. It is not that we have not had a modernization, but we've been imposing Western modernization on ourselves. Basically, continuation of the colonial model that dominated us. And therefore, what we need is to chart an independent path of modernization, an independent path that looks into our interests. And that's why you see the rebellion in the Sahel by the young leaders across there, because that modernization that we have been subjected to means that you produce the bulk of the uranium and your people are in darkness and they're writing other countries. So what modernization here means that Africa has to look into its own interests, has to look into its own resources, and leverage whatever advantages coming from the globalized world, particularly from the global south, from China, and begin to own the economy. This is essentially what we're talking about, the third liberation. The third liberation is about charting an independent path to modernize our economies and own them. And the enemies of that particular process, the threats to that particular process, are both external and internal. We need to focus both on the external and external threats by way of saying that we need quality leadership that will understand what modernization is and what modernization is not. Modernization is not following the West and being subservient to the interests of the West. It is about prioritizing Africa's development, the empowerment of the bulk of its people.
And of course, let me rope in Hannah. With that in mind, globalization, modernization, very key at this day and age. What should Africa do to reach the stage China has? And of course, leveraging on that particular issue when it comes to globalization.
Well, I think, these are very big questions. And of course, China is an inspiration in terms of where it has landed so far. If we look at the changes since the multilateral system was created 80 years ago, we have not seen much amongst the main economies between the main economies and the rest of the world. But what we've seen is a shake-up within those main economies, US, China, Europe, etc. And so the question is, in the multilateral order, which has not really served Africa's interests, we would shape it in quite a different way if we had more decision-making power. What do we want? How do we work and push a number of partners and work with China, for example, to shape it more in our interests? That does mean things like more open source. It does mean things like more specific types of trade agreements that might also work collectively for the continent and so on. There are a huge number of demands from the African side for the multilateral system. And I think the question for us at this moment is how can China support that? Not just in terms of working with countries individually, as we've been discussing, things like the modernization, but also on the global governance agenda. And the more discussions that we have between African leaders and Chinese leaders, then we can actually push that forward.
So I want to hear from you, James, where Africa can leverage on what has come out from China's two sessions, particularly this year being the 25th anniversary of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. How do you see, or how can these mechanisms be strengthened to further strengthen China-Africa relations, not only in terms of political relations, but also in terms of trade?
Yeah, I think it's very important that Africa leverages the approach China is having to put value into the ongoing attempt to implement what we call the continental free trade area. Because we have a framework already where African governments have agreed that, okay, let's open our markets amongst ourselves. So first we need the infrastructure, but second we need to do value addition within Africa so we grow markets within Africa. As Professor pointed out earlier, we've been looking at our orientation towards the West. Everything we do, we want to export to the West. Coffee to the West, tea to the West. But we'd like to have the coffee here as well. The tea needs to be consumed here. So Africa can leverage on this so that we grow markets within Africa. Also recognize the fact that actually Africa offers the future for population. If you look at the year 2100, this will be the region with the highest number of people. So if we borrow from China, how they have managed to grow domestic market, leverage on their own population to go to the next level, Africa has that possibility if we go for high quality development, meaning not short term, but long term as well. And then the third point is to look at the metrics. I think we've been utilizing mostly Western centered metrics of GDP, gross domestic product, which is mostly measuring tons of output, and forgetting about the quality of life, the living standards of our own people. That's why countries can boast of exporting so much tonnage of material to another country, yet their population is poor. So I think it's urgent for us in the point of modernization as well to look at the metrics that we use, review them so that the metrics align to our domestic challenges.
So I'm going to take another comment from the floor. Yes, go ahead.
My question is to Hannah. How can China's high-quality Belt and Road Initiative contribute to the successful implementation of Africa's Continental Free Trade Agreement by enhancing infrastructure, connectivity, industrialization, and trade facilitation across the continent?
There had been, prior to the FOCAC 2024, this concern and also narrative that somehow China was running out of money, was unable to support infrastructure projects, and the infrastructure projects that China had been supporting were all white elephants and all this sort of thing, and really buying into this idea that African countries especially, we can't do things well. While I think FOCAC 2024 said that absolutely isn't right. Infrastructure remains critical for the African continent. And also China's committed and remains committed to supporting African countries with, we are borrowing money that we'll be paying back for these infrastructure projects. Of course, we need to make sure that we're really invested, that we're picking the right projects, that we are working hard to make sure that they are operational quickly, that they, the idea that you build the nest and make sure that the birds come, quickly. This is something that we will do. The African Continental Free Trade Area is excellent. It's been operational since 2021. But at the same time, we cannot increase trade unless we have better logistics. And logistics is one of the key priorities for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And there's also in Agenda 2063, which is Africa's blueprint for development, we have this program for infrastructure development. And most of those projects there are cross-border projects. We cannot have a free trade area without more cross-border projects. And I think African leaders came to FOCAC to say that, and Chinese leadership also listened. And I think that will continue to have that as a linchpin of the relationship, as well as many other things.
And indeed, that's all for this special edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guest, that is Hannah Ryder. She is the Chief Executive Officer, Development Reimagined. Also, Aina Tanjan, the Senior Fellow at the Tehi Institute and Current Affairs Commentator. Here with us in studio is Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and Chief Executive, Africa Policy Institute, and as well as James Shikwati, the founder of Inter-Region Economic Network. Also, a big thank you to our researchers from the Africa Policy Institute and students from the University of Nairobi. My name is Abdiaziz Hashim from the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation.
And I'm Beatrice Marshall from CGTN. Until next time, goodbye.